certainly in my organizations, when I've had a conflict between two colleagues or something like that, I've always found that going back to what's important and what the goal actually is helps reduce a lot of that, right? If one person wants to go off in this avenue and one person goes off in that avenue, it's great to listen to them and say, hey, I understand what you're saying, but this is our deadline, right? This is what we have to accomplish, because it creates not only something neutral, but it also ties us into what's important.
Welcome to the podcast about communication in business. I'm your host, George Torok. Did you know that I'm also known as the speech coach for executives? Because I help business leaders deliver the intended message for greater success. And we do that through one-on-one coaching or group training for the team. Through this podcast, we're talking to communication experts from around the world to give you that edge when it comes to your communication. My guest today is Vanessa Thompson. Here's 3 facts that I think you should know about Vanessa. 1, she spent the last 10 years working at the intersection of clean tech, finance, and innovation. Sounds exciting. Where she's been part of Silicon Valley startups and venture capital groups driving meaningful change. 2, she's currently writing a book on innovation featuring 60 case studies that provide practical results-based insights for businesses to break free and thrive even during challenging times. And that's when you want to thrive. And 3, Vanessa's growing up in Silicon Valley. She's been surrounded by a culture that values creativity and bold thinking. That upbringing shaped her into someone who sees challenges not as obstacles, but as opportunities for problem solving and innovation. Vanessa Thompson, welcome to Your Intended Message.
George, thank you so much for having me.
Delighted to be talking with you today on communication, but specifically how that fits into and becomes a critical part of innovation. In working with, you mentioned that one of the facts that you've seen or been working with startups, and startups typically have something new that they're bringing along. Here's this new product, here's this new service, here's this idea that we'd like to get across. Let's first look at the communication challenges they face. And where do they fail?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question, because I think that, when we're thinking about, even the meaning of this podcast, your intended message, it's about not only communicating effectively, but it's also about having effective conflict as well, too. And that's something that we don't normally talk about when we're talking about innovation, is that innovation is inherently messy. It means that we have to have a lot of diversity of thought to be able to rapidly evolve at the pace that we need to. And in order to do that, we have to have effective conflict, which means we need to build a sense of psychological safety. We need to build that trust. And we also need to be open-minded enough to have that conflict and understand that that's actually something that's useful. I don't know if you have seen that in your own teams, if you've seen that, the best teams are those that actually can argue, they can disagree, and they understand that that's part of the process.
And I agree with you now. I know there were times when I certainly disagreed with that idea, because I had fallen into the trap that thinking, hey, we're supposed to get along here. We're supposed to be on the same team. But you're pointing out the truth is that a really effective team, especially with innovation, and I've never heard of innovation before referred to as messy. But I like that concept. It makes sense, because too many people think of innovation as, we're there, we've arrived.
Right.
And it's not, doesn't work that way, does it?
Absolutely. And oftentimes when you think of kind of the most innovative organizations, which I think of as startups, right? They're normally a really small team, probably a really diverse group of people that have very different skill sets, because they all have to wear different hats. And they're all, fighting and working 24/7 towards this goal. And they all know that they have that underlying shared vision of what they want for the future. But the reality is that the way they see going about that is going to be entirely different, right? The CEO is going to completely disagree with the CTO at times, right? Because they have different skill sets, different perspectives. And that actually is a good thing. And I think that we don't understand that enough. And organizations that want to be more innovative need to understand that that actually is something they should embrace. They should have that healthy conflict. They should be actually thinking about, okay, let's bring in more diversity into our organization. And that can be diversity of skill sets, that can be diversity in terms of demographics, but it's actually really healthy for the organization. There's one study that comes to mind that was kind of these two different, both psychological and demographic groups of investors. And one of them was most risk tolerant, and the other one was kind of more risk aggressive. And they put one group of group A and then group B, and then a mix of group A and B in one group. And the group that was the most diverse outperformed either of the two groups threefold. And I think that's a really great example for any group. It doesn't have to just be investors, but it showcases that principle is that when you actually have that healthy tension of one group that's saying, let's be more risk tolerant, and the other one that's saying, let's be more aggressive in that regard, you actually have this perfect compromise between the two, and you're able to come up with a better strategy that's much healthier, and the portfolio benefits. So I think that's true in a lot of organizations, but if you're able to master that, if you're able to hone that, you can be much more innovative in your own teams. I don't know if you've experienced that yourself.
And Vanessa, what I'm hearing is that if everyone in the room is in full agreement, you're in the wrong room.
Yeah, absolutely. You should always be getting pushed in a good way, right? And that's not just in terms of conflict, but of course, they always say that you should always be, in a room that's full of people who are much smarter than you, who are much more talented than you, right? You should constantly be being pushed. And if you want to be in a really innovative team, you have to be thinking about curating that.
And I suppose it's a good end to the meeting if everyone can leave the room and say, you know what, we didn't all see it the same way. However, we agreed on this course of action, even though we see it differently.
Yeah, that's a really great point, George. I really like that. And I think that kind of ties into something bigger here, which is one of the things that we see that really ties us together. We kind of talked about, okay, we need to have that disagreement, but we also need to have what ties us together. And ultimately, what that is a shared vision. And you have to have an incredibly strong vision. And to be able to communicate that effectively, which is, the point of this podcast, you have to be able to communicate that shared vision. When you think of all the companies that you've seen that are the real leaders in terms of innovation, the ones that have created technologies that have redefined markets and things like that, they all had a very clear mission. They had a shared vision where every employee felt like they were a part of that vision. I'll even take kind of an unconventional example here, which is when we think about a marketing innovation. I mean, Patagonia has actually been an incredibly innovative marketer. They had their famous campaign, I don't know if you've seen it, where they said, don't buy this, and they showed their sweater. That was incredibly innovative. I mean, no marketer has ever thought about don't buy my product, right? But it ended up going so much better than they expected. It really created that brand loyalty. They realized that their values were more important than even just one marketing campaign. And it ended up benefiting their brand image so much. And so when you think about, creating that shared vision that actually draws the team together, motivates them, and then engages them in the work, you have to be thinking about, okay, what is our shared vision? It has to be authentic. What's pulling us together,
And what I'm hearing there is that even though there can be conflict, there is one part that needs to be clear and everyone has to be in agreement on, and that's the vision. We need to have the same vision. If we don't have the same vision, then there's no chance of it working.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to have that shared vision, and that also has to come from a place of authenticity. And I always like to say that the organizations that are most effective in innovation, their shared vision is actually quite existential, meaning that each one of the employees feels that connects with them on some level, right? Which means that they're not going to get pulled away by a competitor just because they offered them a slightly higher salary, right? They're staying at that organization. They're fully engaged at that organization. They're motivated because they feel that that's part of them, that's actually going to benefit them in a way that just the paycheck won't, right? And I think this is something a lot of organizations are struggling with. They're struggling with employee engagement. They're struggling with their employees, hopping, jobs every 2 years and things like that. And the way that you kind of build that retention to create an innovative culture is you have to create that existential purpose that's really authentic and connects with each of the employees.
How does an organization clarify the vision and ensure that everyone is on side with the vision, at least the vision, if nothing else? How do they do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not easy. It's not a straightforward process. And I'll give an example of Interface. Interface is a kind of interesting case study in this regard. It's actually one of the case studies that I have in my book. And they transformed from being not an innovative business that was actually in a very dirty industry to being one of not only the cleanest businesses in the United States, but also being the most innovative. And they made a complete switch after they were already in mid-cap stocks. They were already a public company. They were already established. They already had their investors. And suddenly they make this huge transition. This is not a story you normally hear about. And it all happened in the 1990s too. So this was a very different time as well. And what happened is that Ray Anderson wanted to become a more innovative company. And he also wanted to create this sense of purpose that we were talking about, this shared vision that connects with each of the employees. And he had read a book on, going not only carbon negative, but becoming restorative. And he wanted that to be the core mission. And that was going to be their source of innovation. They're going to create all new patents surrounding that, essentially. And they were going to compete in the market using that strategy. And he did this, and it wasn't successful for 2 years. He actually, even though he was the CEO and founder of the company, it took 2 years of him convincing the entire organization that this was going to be something that was worth it for them to actually come on board. And what ended up hooking the deal is actually showcasing a small win. So they created this really, really incredible patent where they created recyclable fabric for all of their carpeting. They were a carpet manufacturing company. It was thought not to be possible before that point. And they created a patent to make that possible. And that's what hooked the deal. So sometimes it's actually showing that this incredibly beautiful vision is possible that ends up connecting it with the employees. I think that's something that's interesting. It's actually when you say, here's this wonderful vision of the future. Now, it may not connect with you yet, but let me have you work on something that I know is going to be a win and showcase that win. And then you end up feeling connected with that vision. So I think one great practice for everyone listening to this, for your intended message, is thinking about what are the small wins, because those small wins actually really draw people in.
And I can see that because one person, the leader, the CEO, the founder, might have this wonderful vision. Mm-hmm. However, no one else sees it or believes it just yet. And so that CEO, that leader needs to convey their vision. Mm-hmm. And you just described the use of having a small win, because now a person can go, oh, maybe it's possible. Maybe we can do that. What a great idea. Oh, I'd like to be part of that. So I can see them going through that transition, even though they don't come on board right away.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that, shared vision is something that, I can even relate to in terms of all the teams where I felt motivated, I felt engaged, I showed up to work, right? I felt like this was a bigger project than just something I was getting paid for, right? This is something that was existential for me. I don't know, George, have you experienced that where the teams where you felt really engaged, felt really motivated, were the teams where there was a really clear kind of shared vision and structure surrounding that?
Yes. And actually only one point in my career, I remember the organization I worked for and the role we had, it was to have a massive impact on reducing and standardizing the spending of a large corporation, a huge corporation. And I was part of that supply chain department that was putting that together. And to me, I thought, wow, we're doing something good here. And not only did we work on costs, but we also, of course, got into the whole concern about environment and ease of use. And like there was more to it than just, okay, this is my job kind of thing.
Right.
There's something bigger here. And that's exciting. And I'm also reminded of, the small wins, the importance of the small wins. I've run a few marathons. And in the beginning, I didn't believe that I could run a marathon. I didn't.
Oh, wow.
I didn't. Okay. I trained. And I started with, I was running since high school, and I kept saying, I'll run a marathon someday. I'll run a marathon. People say, when? I don't know. Tomorrow, whenever
right.
that is.
Right.
And then I discovered that there was half marathons. And I thought, that was about twice the distance that I was running at the time. And I thought, maybe I could do a half. And I
Yeah.
did. I completed a half, and I did that. And then there was another race that wasn't quite a full marathon. It was around the Bay race here in Burlington, and it was about 30K, so not quite a full marathon, which is 42K or 26 miles. So I thought, okay, from half marathon to 30K, I did that, and then eventually the next step was a full marathon. But I had to get there in steps,
Okay.
and so many pursuits we go after in life. If we break it down into steps, it's now more doable.
Yeah. No,
And
absolutely.
and the other interesting part is in this case it was self-talk. The self-talk. Oh, George, you can do the George, keep doing. Look what you did. Look what you did. You can go next. And I can see a leader of a team doing the same thing when they're pursuing innovation, something new, a new technology, a new method. About, hey, that's never been done before. Yeah, so what? Maybe it can be.
Yeah.
And the leader of the team, have you found in the cases that you've studied, how often is part of their role to be the biggest cheerleader?
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of it. And I think that kind of ties into not just being a cheerleader for the team, but being a really good active listener too. I think being a good cheerleader really involves being a great listener to the team, because a huge part of getting buy-in from the team is making sure that they know that their individual goals are heard and that ties in to the larger mission, right? Because you're not going to get someone to show up fully if they don't feel heard, if they don't feel like their voice is, being taken seriously. So I think a huge part of being a cheerleader is also actually active listening and really listening to what they have to say.
And that is interesting insight there, that cheerleader is more than just about making noise. It's about actually listening to what people are saying and how you're coming across to them. The toughest innovation, where have you seen that? What areas is it? Is it a technology? Is it industries? Where's innovation the toughest?
Well, certainly I think that every industry has their own innovation challenges. And certainly I think that the greatest innovators see those challenges as opportunities. But I think that when we're just thinking about how do we build a team, how do we communicate to that team, irregardless of the industry, I think that it comes back actually to something that we just mentioned, which is listening. I think that's a huge piece of it in terms of how do we create effective teams and innovative culture in any organization, in any industry, which is it's a really broad take on it. But I think that listening is a huge piece of it. I'll give one kind of case study of a really great company that was very innovative in the hospitality space, for example. And they're called Red Sea Global. They're an interesting hospitality development organization where they build hotels in new areas, particularly along the Red Sea. And they are a great case study in terms of listening. And it's a very surprising story. So they came into this local area, this village, and a huge part of this is listening to your stakeholders. And this village was a part of their stakeholders, even though they're a large conglomerate. And so they said, we're going to be a great listener to this village. And oftentimes development companies aren't, right? They kind of just move people out of the way. But they were like, no, we're really going to go in there. We're going to listen to people. We're going to listen to what they want. We're going to have them be part of the innovation. We're going to change the game in this regard. And the people asked for two really strange things that seem completely unrelated from business, but ended up being the hack for innovation. The first was the villagers said, we want a banana farm. And the second said they wanted sailboats because that's part of their culture. And if you were any other business leader that wasn't thinking with that innovative mindset, you probably would have said, hey, that's great, but that has nothing to do with my business. That's, I can't do that. That just doesn't, align with what I'm doing, right? But they said, no, we're actually going to go all the way down this road and we're going to figure out a way that this connects with our business model. And so they invested in acres and acres and acres of all of this agricultural land and created a complete farm to table experience that was very unique for all of their hotels, giving really premium culinary service to all of their hotel guests, which really got them much higher rankings in terms of their hospitality. And the second thing they did is they did invest in those sailboats that were specific to their local culture. That was really important. And they trained the locals on how to sail those sailboats. and take all of the hotel guests around in these sailboats. And now it's this incredibly unique experience where people will fly all around the world to go to these really unique sailing activities. And so it ended up making it so much more unique as an experience for their hotel guests, and something that made this hotel stand out all over the world. And they've gotten really high rankings because of it. And so this is what I mean by listening, because this is actually true for a lot of people. The first time you listen to someone, it may seem completely unrelated to your goals. You might think, that has nothing to do with what I was talking about, right? I need to think about my own goals. But really try to keep that innovative mindset, really try to listen to them, and then think about, how does that connect with the business model? How can I just completely think outside the box here? How does what you're saying connect with the business model? Because that ends up being a great source of innovation. That ends up being a great hack. So listening actually can be a fantastic source of innovation, surprisingly.
And I can just see those people in their boardroom when these villagers say, we want a banana farm. And they're going, what?
Yeah.
Are you crazy? And somehow they find a way to make it work.
Yeah.
And work not only for the locals, but also work for the hotel itself. And create a distinguishing factor for these hotels.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that this is really a great lesson for all of us, because oftentimes we're thinking, okay, we need to innovate, we need to come up with new ideas, but we have a very small range in terms of how we think that works, right? And if you really want to have a breakthrough innovation, something that redefines your product, you have to be thinking about, how does this wild idea that's over here connect with the business model? And constantly be thinking about that. And you actually need to get true diversity of thought. No one in the boardroom would have come up with either of those things, right? They had to go to their stakeholders to get that. So that's where diversity of thought also plays a huge role in this. You have to be getting that diversity of thought and then constantly be going back to, how does that connect to the business model? How does that connect with the business model, right? And that's where you get your real source of innovation.
And have you found that there's a thought process about the rules in the room that we need to go through as we're innovating? Is there a change in what those rules are? And what does that look like?
Absolutely. Yeah, there actually does need to be a structure around innovation. So that's the surprising thing, is that we do have to think, out of the box. We have to be creative, but we need a structure around creativity. So one great example of this is Pixar. They're a very innovative company, and they actually have a structure around creativity. And I think it's a really great case study for all of us to learn from. So oftentimes what happens with innovation is someone innovative will come into a room and say, here's this crazy out of the box idea. And immediately they'll get shut down, right? Because they're like, no, the purpose of this meeting was just to go over today's budget or something like that, right? And they're saying that's off topic. So what they have done is they actually have 3 different types of rooms. They have the first room is out of the box ideas, crazy, off the wall, just completely wild ideas. The second room is curating all of those ideas, saying which of those should we prioritize, which of those make the most sense. And the third is actually the logistical piece. How do we make it happen? And that kind of thing. So when you're actually booking a room for your meeting in a Pixar campus, you're actually going to book one of those 3 types of rooms. And that actually gives a structure for how the conversation is going to go. So I think this comes back to your intended message, right? Creating a real literal space for what type of communication we're going to have. What type of innovation stage are we going to have? And what this does is it creates really nice psychological safety, meaning that if I step into the wild ideas room, I can really throw out all my most creative ideas and know that people are not going to judge me or shut me down immediately, but they might actually say, okay, I hadn't thought about that. Maybe even if I think that's wild and crazy, I'm still going to try to find a way to make it work, right? I'm still going to try to see what the value is in that. And that enables people to actually be more innovative, to actually develop that culture of innovation, because they know that that is the space for that. And then you kind of move along until you get to the logistical piece of it. But when you're even a larger organization or a small organization, and you're thinking about, okay, we need to innovate. We are in a competitive market. We need to be coming up with new product ideas. We need to be, innovating more often. Think about creating a structure, a physical space, or even a series of, phrases that are nice. Some of the things that Disney and Pixar do is they have the yes and concept, which is you always say yes and when someone else says something. This is a very famous concept which it confirms what the other person is saying, and then you move on to your own point. And you can find other ways to do this as well too. But whether it's a phrase or physical space, really take the time to think about how can I design a structure around innovation so that I can foster it. Because you can't just go to your team and say, okay, we need to come up with new product ideas. We need to innovate, right? You have to create a system for that. I don't know if, George, if you've been in an organization like this where they created a system around innovation, but I think it's something really interesting. It's something that we feature in the book quite often.
And the rooms, the concept of the rooms, so the different rooms for different types of thinking, that to me seems brilliant because when we get into an environment, we take on the atmosphere of the environment. And I've found in my experience that typical boardrooms are the worst place to create new ideas because we typically go to the boardroom to defend. To present, to defend or to attack someone else who didn't meet their department goals.
Right.
And so boardrooms are not friendly, open, warming places. But when we create a room that's to think creatively, that's the purpose of this room. This room is not to answer the question, how we'll do that. That's another room right now. And to me, I would spend a lot of time in that room and just love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it motivates you. It excites you. It makes you feel like, okay, there's something exciting to go to work, to do the next day, right? Because you're thinking about, okay, I can, be creative. And then, okay, yeah, I can get stuff done later in the day or something like that, right? But I think that we all have that desire to be more creative. And so that creates a structure around it that actually makes sense. And I think that kind of bridges into the concept of thinking about, okay, how do you kind of curate that? Once you have that creativity, how do you then connect it to the business model, right? Like, Red Sea Global did. How do we connect this down? How do we prioritize certain things? And I think that all comes down to having what I like to call the mutually beneficial goal. So you always have to be coming back to what's our actual goal as an organization and as a company. That's what really helps reduce conflict. It helps create effective conflict. It also helps prioritize what we're going to work on and what kind of innovations we're going to prioritize. Is it we need to sell more product? Well, if we're thinking about innovation, probably not. We probably have to be thinking about developing new products that are actually going to surpass our existing products, right? So think about your larger organizational goal and then tie that into each of your challenges as an organization. So thinking about what do you prioritize? How do you have effective conflict, right? Some things that you could not use, other things that you could use. You always have to be going back to that mutually beneficial goal. What is it that ties us all together? What is it that brings us together? What's our actual goal? Because I don't know if you've experienced this, George, but certainly in my organizations, when I've had a conflict between two colleagues or something like that, I've always found that going back to what's important and what the goal actually is helps reduce a lot of that, right? If one person wants to go off in this avenue and one person goes off in that avenue, it's great to listen to them and say, hey, I understand what you're saying, but this is our deadline, right? This is what we have to accomplish, because it creates not only something neutral, but it also ties us into what's important. And I think that that's something that I'd like to leave a lot of our listeners with. And it's certainly something I talk with a lot of my clients with as well, too, when I'm thinking about how do we design an innovative culture? How, are my clients going to become more innovative in the next quarter, right? We have to be thinking about what is the overarching goal for the business. It may not be the product. It may not even be the industry. Right? But define what that is and tie everything into that, because that actually helps you overcome a lot of the challenges you may be facing.
And Vanessa, I'm going to reinforce that for our listeners, because what I hear there that resonates with me is even though we can have different ways that we think we need to get there, we need to start by saying or conveying, this is what we do know. This is what we agree on. Here's what we have in common. Here's what we have in common. We see different ways to get there, but let's start with what we have in common so that we confirm that, hey, we are on the same side. We do want the same goals. We just see different ways of getting there. And I'm reminded of, I was a Star Trek fan, and especially Jean-Luc Picard. And I always adored how he, when they're faced with a problem, a situation, he would stand and he'd say to his leaders, he'd say, options. And each person would give a different option. And he would pick one and he'd say, okay, do that. And because they knew what the goal was, but they had different ways to getting there. And he needed diversity of thought to get to survive, to complete. And at no time did he ever say, that was a dumb idea. Where'd you come up with that? Right. No, he just said, let's do this one. And he'd go with it and everyone go, okay, we're in on this. We're all in.
Yeah, absolutely. And people didn't feel shut down, even if he said no, right? Because they understand the mutually beneficial goal. Each of them, not just the captain, understood that goal, right? They all understood, okay, what are we all fighting for? We're in this together. What are we all fighting for? And reinforcing that. He's obviously done a great job in reinforcing that with his team, right? In order to get to that, he's saying every day they wake up and they're saying, this is our goal. This is our goal, right? And so even if you get shut down, which of course we don't want to shut anyone down, but in the case that, you have to make a really effective call in a deadline, no one feels like, oh, okay, I'm not going to share my idea again, because they understand that they're still part of that team that's accomplishing that goal. Yeah, I think that's a perfect example.
And I like the example of, you've got a team there. You got a diverse team. You got a team of different species. You've got a Klingon. You've got a robot.
Just like Silicon Valley.
yeah, just all these weird things. Vanessa, as we prepare to wrap up, if you could sit with a team leader of an organization that's facing challenges in the market, perhaps they faded into the background. They're not standing out. They're not differentiating. They're losing market share. If you could offer that team leader 1, 2, or 3 pieces of advice of how they might approach innovation successfully and effectively, what would be that advice?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's something that a lot of the people who, I'm doing keynotes or workshops with are wanting to answer to, or, whether it's a team leader, right, who I'm working with as kind of a consultant. I think that each of these individuals, I think, need to be thinking about, I would say, 4 main things. The first thing is that you should listen first. So before you start kind of panicking about your own goals and things like that, really take the time to listen, authentically listen. And as we mentioned, try to think about how you can make it work. Right? Really go down that rabbit hole of saying, how does this tie into the business model? Right? So listen first. The second is use stories, because that really engages your team. That makes it emotionally resonant. That really engages them. We're all connected to stories. So try to use stories to motivate and engage your team around a mutually beneficial goal. And the third is create a shared vision that's existential, right? Create a really big vision. Maybe it's going, carbon negative. Maybe it's about, feeding people along the way, right? Something that's actually an authentic vision that you can see. That's a real vision for the organization that ties each of your employees into that, because that will actually generate a lot more ideas and get people a lot more creative. And the fourth is celebrate the small wins. So really try to break things down. We talked about this, Georgia, on the podcast as well. Really think about how can we make those baby steps, whether it's running a marathon or running a business. How can we create those small wins so that we can actually motivate people and show them that it's possible to do this?
My guest today is Vanessa Thompson, reminding you that when someone suggests that you plant a banana farm, you listen to how that might help the organization.
Yes.
If you like what you heard, tell your friends. And post your 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because that helps more listeners find us. Come back every week for more practical insights to help you deliver your intended message. I'm your host, George Torok.